Thanks a lot, David, for this nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's a great series of lectures, great event, and I'm really very much thrilled to be here and to give you a little bit my perspective on collective behavior, in particular on modeling collective behavior with agent-based models. Maybe to the structure of this lecture, I will first give like a high-level overview of how we model collective behaviors with agent-based models, what different types of collective behavior are actually people considering, and how are they modeled. And then I will zoom in a little bit more on a particular aspect, which I'm particularly excited about from my research, which is collective movement, and how I think we need a paradigm change on how we model systems, and we actually witness this paradigm change in space, and where me or my group is actually contributing also to as well. But let's get started. So first of all, we are interested in collective behavior here. And if you look in nature, you see all these beautiful examples of collective behavior across scales, right? So you can start, you can look at organismic systems like, or animal systems like fish groups or bird flocks. You can look even at microbiological systems like bacteria also exhibiting collective behavior. But then you can, of course, also go to human systems, human crowds, as examples of collective systems that perform some sort of collective behavior. So in general, collective behavior is kind of a little bit vaguely defined, but it's definitely a very interdisciplinary field of research. It encompasses biology, psychology, sociology, but also physics, mathematics, and engineering. It goes from studying actual biological system, understanding biology, to all the way to creating and building artificial systems, swarms of robots, for example, interacting together, sometimes bio-inspired, sometimes completely designed by corresponding engineering methods and approaches. And it is if you think of collective behavior, it's a little bit a very general and broad term. So what you can actually, and what we will see, it encompasses a wide range of different types of behavior. And they can be quite different in terms of what they actually, what the actual function, for example, is, or what the actual dynamics is of what the collective does. What is also important to note about collective behavior as a field, because it's so interdisciplinary, it may appear sometimes also fragmented in the sense that very similar phenomena can be studied in parallel in different disciplines. So, for example, collective movement, coordinated movement of groups, sometimes referred to as flocking, inspired by bird flocks. They move very synchronized in one direction. All these animals, or think of also artificial agents like maybe drones moving together. So this flocking as a phenomenon can be studied in biology to understand how birds or fish do that. Or it can be studied from an engineering perspective in order to achieve highly synchronized movements on large group of artificial autonomous agents, drones or mobile robots. And even if there is some kind of maybe cross-inspiration, the engineers might look into what the animals are doing to inspire the interaction. Sometimes this is very disconnected, so there's not much crosstalk. It may be cross-inspiration, but not a lot of crosstalk. However, there are also instances where actually mathematicians, engineers, and biologists work very closely together, and I think SciOI is one example, so our cluster here, where we have this very close interconnection, which is really exciting. And for me personally, this is also where the most exciting research takes place, where there's actually this really two very different disciplines meeting together, and I have to say, one of the most challenging but also exciting experiences in the past years was, for example, working for me with psychologists who study collective behavior of humans, which I have never studied before. And now we are trying to model this and actually trying to understand how humans make collective decisions together. Okay, so this is kind of motivation. What is collective behavior? And we can see it's kind of a very, very multifaceted term and research field. But how do we model the systems? Actually, modeling turned out to be, one very important cornerstone of investigating collective behavior, also in biology, for example, because it allows us to test hypotheses in silico, in a computer, regarding the interaction between individuals. But there's a whole range of possibilities and mathematical approaches how you could model collective behavior. And you can actually order them a little bit in a hierarchy. And the hierarchy can be, speaking about the complexity, how do we actually describe interactions between many individuals, many agents that compose a collective, that compose a group. So let's think of like some kind of agents, could be fish, could be robots, whatever. And you want to model them, you want to describe mathematically what they do collectively. And the simplest type of models mathematically is to consider something which I refer to as mean field models or well-mixed models, which basically ignores any kind of structure within the group, but just says that at any given time, potentially each agent is able to interact with any other agents of the group. This could be a fully connected graph, so that everyone sees everyone and can talk to everyone at any point, or averages the behavior of all others. This could be something where it's, as I said, a well-mixed model, so you interact only with one agent or a small subset of agents at any given time, but at each time you can change which agents you interact with, so effectively you kind of mix your interaction neighborhood all the time so that you can interact effectively over time with the whole group again. And these models are, of course, strongly idealized, because if you think of real-world scenarios, there are few examples where this would probably be biologically reasonable. So, for example, if we are in a small group and I can really see everyone and interact with everyone, or I have some very long time scales where, in principle, sequentially, I can talk to everyone, even if I don't see everyone at the same time. But for the dynamics of interest, I can average over long time scales. So they are idealized, but the big advantage of this type of models is that they are mathematically simple, and they often allow actually to do pen and paper calculations and actually generate nice theories and nice theoretical predictions that can be tested both in numerical simulation but also in experiment. So you have the highest level of understanding of what the system does because it's so simple mathematically. The next level of abstraction, which moves towards more realistic assumptions, that you actually have some kind of a network model. That you have your agents, and now not everyone can interact with everyone at any given time, but you have actually a graph structure underlying the interaction, so something like a social interaction network. And this can be static, this can be also dynamic, so it can change over time. And it can be also adaptive in the sense that it can even depend on the behavior of individual agents, which agent wires to which agent. But still, there's no real space or no real environment. It's kind of an abstract representation of the social interactions between the agents in form of a mathematical graph. So again, this is kind of maybe more realistic because you can map a lot of systems in reality to a graph, to a network, especially if this network is adaptive and dynamic. But it's still kind of mathematically well-defined and treatable in the sense that there are nice methods how to analyze graphs, how to do calculations on graphs, how to do some general predictions. So also here you can maybe do some kind of pen and paper calculations, but if not, there are very efficient methods how to simulate graphs, for example, and do agent-based models on networks. And therefore, these type of model play a very important role. But finally, if we will go to the real world, if you really think of collective behavior in space and time, then you arrive at the kind of most complicated situation, I would say, the spatially explicit models. So where you have actually agents now, let's say in 2 dimensions, somewhere in X and Y, so they're distributed, and who interacts with whom is defined by the spatial position and the structure of the group. And how we calculate, of course, the network. So the network itself, the interaction network, is not given by some sort of rules or just static. It's actually emerging from the movement dynamics of individuals. And I will discuss about this a little bit more later. So in a sense, now we can think of this as a hierarchy of models from like kind of simple and no structure in the social interactions to some kind of fixed or predefined or simple graph-like structure to actually self-organized structure, which also leads to a self-organized network of interactions. So this is probably the closest to reality in most cases. If we think especially of of groups acting in real space and real time, like for example the flock of birds that we saw in the introductory slide. But this is also the type of models which are the most difficult to analyze mathematically, and usually you have to resort to numerical simulation, to large-scale numerical simulations, but also they are more expensive in computational terms than, for example, such graph-based interactions. So for example, if you have long-range interactions, you can think of who interacts with whom, and this interaction can be potentially very long-range. So in principle, my network could be with everyone within the group. your complexity scales with n squared, and then you have this spatial models, which for very large systems become very computationally expensive. There are ways to speed them up, and oftentimes we have only local interactions in space, so that I only interact with neighbors that are close in space, and there you can speed this up, but still it's much more complicated than the other two approaches. So this is in terms of this general hierarchy on how do I quantify who interacts with who. But there are also other aspects that you may consider when modeling collective behavior. And the important part is, how do you actually describe the temporal and the spatial evolution? What is your state space, for example? And there you can basically subdivide all existing models of collective behavior, and I will discuss some of them later, into whether they have a discrete time or continuous time, or whether they have discrete state space and continuous state space. And of course, discrete time and discrete state space are usually abstractions, which make things computationally more efficient and simpler. They are not necessarily reflecting reality in the sense that we act in a continuous time, but sometimes this is a very good approximation for a lot of collective behaviors that we have. And if we have both discrete time and discrete state space, so really the time goes and jumps from one step to the next one, and discrete state, you have what I would call rule-based models. So there could be models like cellular automata, where you update your system in discrete time, discrete time steps. You have some discrete states that each cell in your system or each node in your graph can take. A VOTA model is a model for opinion formation, is also a model that has both discrete time and discrete state space. So at discrete time steps, individuals that have discrete possible opinion states can change their opinion states according to some interaction mode. Then we can have discrete state space but continuous time, and this is, for example, classically assumed in any model of spreading or contagion. This could be epidemic spreading, but it could be also information spreading in groups, which is also a form of collective behavior. So this usually says that individuals have discrete states, so they are either susceptible or uninformed, or they are infected or informed. And this would be two discrete states, but the whole dynamic plays out actually in continuous time, so we have a continuous progression of time. And then you can have also the other way around, so you can have a continuous state space, but a discrete time. And the Wittig model for collective movement or for flocking is a classical example of this, and I don't have time to go into details how the Wittig model works, but basically the idea is that you have agents in 2D, and they can move with a constant speed, or they move with a constant speed, so the only degree of freedom they have is which direction they move. So they can, it's a continuous state space, because I can move in all the directions in 2D, so my heading angle goes from 0 to 2 pi or 0 to 360 degrees. But what they do in this Wittig model is that the assumption is that at each discrete time, they look around, what are my neighbors doing within a certain range, and then I just try to match my direction of movement instantaneously to the direction of movement of my neighbors. So at discrete times, I update my movement direction with some error, and everyone does that, and eventually there's actually a collective motion emerging that all the simple agents start to move in the same direction. But it happens in discrete time. So in between, when I pick my direction of movement according to my neighbors, I actually move straight for some time, and then I look again, and everyone does this synchronously. That's the discrete time, continuous state space. And finally, we can have both continuous, so that would probably match the most real-world situations. And there are various types of models that we can use. So they are typically formulated in terms of differential equations, and in particular, stochastic differential equations. So actually all models of collective behavior, or all, let's say, meaningful models of collective behavior, always assume that there's some kind of randomness in there. So it's not ordinary differential equations, but stochastic differential equation that you use. And there are models like drift diffusion models, very popular in psychology for decision-making, but also so-called active Brownian agent models, which originate in physics, but describe the movement of biological entities, or can describe the movement of biological entities like bacteria or even animals. And I will discuss this a little bit more later. Okay. So if we know how we implement these things now as a rules in a computer. So for the rule-based, what basically happens, we have discrete time steps, and if a condition is met, then you change the state of your focal agent. So, I would be the index of your agent at the past time, and then there might be a transition from this previous state to a new state at discrete times. And every agent does that, and you can have all sorts of different algorithms. You can have sequential updating, so only one agent is being updated at a given time, or you can have synchronous updating, that all the agents are updated. And already this can make a difference, even if you have the same interaction rule, whether you have a sequential or synchronous updating in this discrete time, discrete state space models actually may make a difference what types of collective behaviors you observe or what kind of stationary states you observe. On the other hand, if we go to the other example here on the other kind of extremum where you have both continuous, we would have, as I said, stochastic differential equations. So we have some change of a state variable, which could be a position of an agent or a velocity of an agent. Generally, it's a vector, that one's bold, because we move them in more than one dimension. And there are two parts in your differential equation. So on the right-hand side, you have usually two parts. One is actually the deterministic part. So really, that will be the ordinary differential equation part. But then usually there's a second part which contains a noise term or random term here, which accounts for the apparent randomness in behavior of individuals. And this can have various origins. So these models typically assume that because this is what we observe in nature, it could be due to some kind of physical impacts. It could be if we consider a microorganism in the same way as a Brownian particle is being pushed around by the water molecules, also microorganisms are being pushed by water molecules and they actually perform Brownian motion. But in most cases, especially if we go to organisms or humans, of course, we are not being pushed by the air molecules around. This doesn't play a role for us. We are far too macroscopic. But still, if you would watch animals do behavior or humans, you would see always a variation. And this is what is usually being tried to capture in the stochastic term. Because this variation or the stochasticity, effectively what it tries to account for are all the potential internal decision processes which are not relevant for the behavior of interest. So there could be something that, thoughts that the agent had, some kind of a maybe random attention to some environmental stimuli which we cannot resolve, but we can model this as a kind of random effect, as a fluctuating force. Okay, so this is just to give you a high-level overview how you would model this type of things, and there are various reasons, or there are good reasons to select, one of those boxes, so to say. So for example, here, if we have discrete state space and discrete time, these are usually the most computationally efficient models, so we can simulate them very quickly, whereas this one are usually the most computationally costly. But of course, these are more idealized systems, whereas here we are closer to potential real-world behavior. But depending on your research question and your research aim, it's perfectly fine to choose either of those. But you have also to be aware of limitations. So assuming, for example, discrete time and a certain dynamics in this discrete time might lead to certain model behaviors which are not suited to, for example, describe real-world behavior of biological systems. So you have to be very careful what conclusions you draw based on the model that you take. Okay. So what type of collective behaviors can we have? And here I attempted some sort of a classification. So it's definitely not complete. I think you can find other behaviors, but it captures most, I would say maybe 90%, 95% of the literature on collective behavior and modeling collective behavior, this type of different collective behavior. So first of all, maybe the most prominent, and I will spend most time talking about this, is collective movement, which encompasses coordinated movement of large groups of agents in 2D, 3D, could be also 1D. So this is basically all phenomena related to flocking, schooling, or swarming. Just for those who are non-experts, flocking and schooling is actually the same. It's animals moving coordinate in one direction, but flocking refers to birds, schooling refers to fish. And swarming would be typically in English. In German we have Schwarmverhalten. That would be kind of general term. Swarming, however, in English rather refers to agents coming together, cohesively forming group, but not necessarily moving collectively in one direction. So this is a bit like a mosquito swarm, That's what you would refer to as swarming. But it's all examples of collective movement. A second one, which is also often studied across many disciplines, is collective decision making. So how do groups make decisions? Then we have opinion formation, closely related to that, synchronization, and contagion. And I will give a little bit more of a definition in the following slides on this. But there are more collective phenomena which don't really fall in this category, strictly speaking. It's because often they actually compose of composite behaviors that actually have aspects both maybe of collective decision-making and synchronization and behavioral contagion and maybe even collective motion. So they are like composite, more complex behaviors, which is of course interesting. And this is also where a lot of recent research goes into studying these more complex behaviors. But let's go step by step through this list here. Let's start with collective motion. So first of all, this is something which, in preparation of this slides I came up a couple of months ago as my definition. But I also thought it was curious just what would like ChatGPT say. So this is a couple of months old, so probably it will give a different answer now. But I found it's actually not bad. It gives like a fairly good description of what collective behavior is about. Collective motion or studying collective motion is about. It's about studying coordinated, synchronized movement of large groups of individuals. And this can be either exhibited by biological agents like fish or birds, or it could be also collective movement of artificial agents like robot swarms. And we have beautiful examples of this. So here you see sardines forming this highly coordinated groups that move together in synchrony. That almost looks like a single organism moving together. Usually this is meant for protection against predators. And then you can have also this kind of rotating states where you have this kind of tornado-like structures. Again, this is also usually considered to be a reaction to predators, especially if they're confined by predators hunting them. Instead of moving forward, they want to move, they want to stay together, and the only possible state is actually being in a kind of rotating living state, and that's what you see here. But you can also think of humans exhibiting collective movement, and this is just an example somewhere from a busy crossing, I think, in Japan, in Tokyo. And if you look closely, at this crossing, there is, of course, it's externally driven because people want to go from A to B, but there will be self-organized effects like lane formation that people don't collide, or you can think of, just dense environments, and people will automatically, due to the kind of physical interaction, start to move together in a collective fashion. But we can also observe collective movement on microscopic scale, and these are now E. coli. I'm not sure that is E. coli bacteria or Bacillus subtilis, some sort of bacteria, which are kind of rod-shaped. They're on a substrate, so they are kind of on a petri dish. And they, what you see is that simply because of physical interaction, so they're elongated, and then when they kind of move together, they align their body axis and therefore start to move in the same direction. And in this way, you already see they form this kind of clusters or swarms, and they can travel together more efficiently than they would on their own. So this is also one example of collective movement exhibited by very simple organisms in biology. How do we model collective behavior? And I already said this, usually we consider this in continuous time and continuous space, and kind of a general approach would be to do this in terms of stochastic differential equations. So essentially, we have n agents, and the focal agent, or with the index I, so there are two n differential equations. One is for the position, so how does the position change over time? It changes because we have actually a velocity vector. So this is the first equation, but then the question is how does the velocity vector change? And here we have an equation of motion. You can actually think of a Newton's equation of motion, so that there's an acceleration. You can have here a mass. We can set the mass to 1 because it's a constant, and scale all the forces on the right-hand side, if you think of a Newton's equation of motion just by the mass. So we have something like scaled forces on the right-hand side, which describe how the velocity of an agent changes. Typically in this type of models, we have 3 components. So first, this is something like an effective individual force. So how does just the speed or direction of movement of an individual change in response to environmental features, for example, obstacles, the substrate, the ground it moves on, and so on. Maybe even wind that comes from the front, or anything else you can think of. So this is the individual. It accounts for propulsion, for friction. All these effects go into this part. Then a very important one when we study collective movement is, of course, that there will be interaction between individuals. So how do I actually interact with others? So I can have attraction, repulsion, or alignment, so I can try to match the direction of movement of my neighbors. And this all goes into this social force, effective social force. And then finally, as I said, we always have the stochastic component. So typically these models also contain a noise force or a random force, which adds to some kind of random fluctuation of the velocity on top of these individual and social interactions. So this is now a large set of differential equations that we have for a large group of agents. For n agents, we have 2 n differential equations. But what we can do is easily take this type of models and put them in a computer and just simulate them. And with modern hardware, even on a single laptop, you can easily simulate 10,000 of individuals in real time, even up to 100,000. If you are able to parallelize it, for example, on a GPU, then you can go to millions quite easily on a single machine. And of course, you can parallelize it by using clusters and so on. So that's one way, and that's oftentimes which has to be used because these models become so complicated, so you can only solve them on a computer. But sometimes there are actually ways to go from this microscopic description at the individual level of individual agents to a macroscopic description at the level of a density field and a velocity field for the whole group. And there are mathematical methods how to do that. It's usually a hard problem, and I spent some time working on this, but there are ways to do this with some simplifications, and you might get some nice insights also from this type of macroscopic theories. It's a little bit like you would describe a fluid by hydrodynamic equations and not by the movement of individual molecules. For example, you can identify through methods in mathematics like analyzing the stability of solutions or finding solution analyzing the stability. You can, for example, identify, where does a certain solution become unstable, where something like a phase transition takes place. So, that I would expect that if this parameter changes, there should be qualitative change in the macroscopic behavior of my system. And this is what we can do with this type of models. And this can, again, inform our large-scale simulations. So if we have many parameters, it's actually hard or impossible to study the full parameter space by numerical simulations alone. But if we have some insights from our theories, we can constrain the parameter space and say, okay, we don't need to look in this parameter region because the theoretical prediction is that it's all will be the same behavior. But actually, this parameter region seems to be interesting, so maybe we should focus on this parameter and change it only there based on our theory. So usually, you try to do this kind of a combined approach, but often this thing is rather hard, and it's more for mathematicians who are really experts in the corresponding methods, and so oftentimes this goes actually along those directions. But it's possible at least. Okay. So what are now the social interactions? How do we model interaction between them? And I already mentioned this a little bit briefly, but I want to elaborate a little bit more on this. So I would say maybe 80, 90 or more % of models for collective movement in the literature actually can be classified as social force models. And I also call them classical social force models, because the very first one that actually proposed this type of model was already proposed by Sakai, actually. This is a mistake. It was a single author. I just learned a few months ago when I was in Japan. They published a paper which already was kind of resembling most of the models that we've seen in literature more than 50 years ago. Of course, the computer abilities or computer hardware was limited, so they were not able to do large-scale simulation, but it was actually surprising how much they did back then with very simple computers in terms of numerical simulations. But what their models basically contained were just 3 types of interactions. One was at short range, you have some sort of a avoidance mechanism, so collision avoidance. If 2 agents or 2 fish or whatever you want to think of come too close, they just want to avoid collision, so they move away from each other. But then, if you are far away, in order to have a cohesive group, typically social force model assumes some sort of attraction, just to have a cohesive group that the group stays together. So if a single individual gets separated from the group, it just feels an attractive force towards other group members. But finally, at the intermediate ranges, so within the kind of comfort distance, you could argue, there's usually a third force being assumed, a so-called alignment force, which basically is the kind of coordination of movement direction force, which basically assumes that a focal individual here in the center can somehow evaluate the average direction of movement of its neighbors in a close neighborhood and tries to match its movement direction to the movement direction of its neighbors. And this is kind of an alignment interaction you can think of. It's actually inspired by alignment of spins in physics, so that they try to point in the same direction. In the same way, you can think of movement directions of agents or individuals that they, with this alignment force, they try to point in the same direction. Which, of course, if this is strong enough, will facilitate collective movement. So, but as I said, the very first model that had this already these three parts was, more than 50 years ago. Since then, many different iterations of this model were proposed in the literature. Very nice, interesting example was by Craig Reynolds in '87. It was actually a computer scientist who was not interested in biology or understanding collective movement. He wanted to make nice computer graphics. And this was a very big thing in the '80s. I'm that old that I remember that you even shared these demos, graphical demos on diskettes, and you were looking, okay, it was just like a 1 minute or 2 minute clip showing something, and you were like amazed of the graphical abilities, which we would laugh about today. But that was a thing back then, and the problem is he wanted to make demos, or Craig Reynolds wanted to make demos to show capabilities of the graphics hardware, which show collective movement of flock of birds, for example, flying together. And the way to do this before was just to prescribe all the trajectories of individual agents for your demo, which is of course a very tedious task to do every time, to prescribe all the trajectories of, let's say, 100 fish or 100 birds. So he thought, oh, can I find a generative way to do this, a generative algorithm? And he came up exactly with this algorithm that was proposed before for movement of fish, this kind of short-range avoidance, mid-range alignment, long-range attraction. And this was rediscovered then by others, including biologists, and Cousin et al. Published a paper which was very similar in general structure. The model was very similar in general structure to Craig Reynolds' paper, but it was actually a biological paper that discovered this kind of modeling and implementation of biological system by agent-based models as a great tool to study the emergent behavior, collective behavior of animal groups and potential implications for the biology of the systems. And this is, basically, this paper was very influential and still is, because it kickstarted the kind of modeling approach, agent-based modeling approach of collective behavior in biology and life sciences in general. There were other papers, which I don't mention here. There was, for example, the Wittig model I mentioned briefly, which was very influential in physics, just a few years before Cousin et al. In the mid-90s. It was actually considering a minimal version of the social force model where there was only alignment. So there was no attraction, no attraction nor avoidance, there was just alignment. That's the only interaction rule. And basically it was considering a very large system of many such agents in periodic boundary conditions, so they could not leave, they were on the torus. And there you could nicely show that with just two parameters, the density and the noise, you could see the emergence of collective movement, ordered movement on arbitrary length scales. So even for infinitely large systems, they would order. So they would show collective movement with where all agents in the system, even if there are millions of them, start to move in the same direction. And this was very influential in physics and also inspired a lot of research in mathematics and engineering. Okay, how does this look like? Here, this is an example from just a master thesis from a student in biophysics in my group. This is just one example of such a classical social force model, evolving now, and you have a group, and it can show like linear motion, so like polarized flocking motion, but sometimes also this milling structures emerging, as we see also in real systems. This is a 2D model. You can easily do also 3D versions of this, as you can imagine. Okay, so these are the social force models, but they are what I refer to all, as physics-based models, also being implemented for collective movement. And this is now inspired by the behavior of bacteria. So essentially what we now consider as a system are self-propelled rods. And this is basically what you can think of a bacterium. So an extended object, and it's self-propelled, so it moves with a certain speed, but when they meet, because of physical interaction, like body collisions, but also the elongated shape, they will automatically align. And if you put many of such self-propelled rods now in a kind of two-dimensional domain, square domain with periodic boundary conditions, So if they leave here, they enter here again. You see this emergence of clusters that move in a very coordinated way. And you can, for example, study how does this emergence of collective motions, for example, depend on an aspect ratio, on how rod-shaped are actually your agents. And just to make the story short, if they are not elongated, if they are like just squares, there's no collective motion, so you really need this particular anisotropy of the shape. And it's pure physics, basically, that you consider here. And the last thing, which is kind of more recent, is what I would refer to as the cognitive or sensory models. Because effectively, so far, we had always this kind of effective forces, whether physical or non-physical, phenomenological, acting between the agents. But in the end, what agents do, animals and we do when we move through a crowded environment or interact in a group, we actually perceive our environment through our sensory system, and we process this information and make a decision how we move. So there's a cognitive and sensory process taking place, which is abstracted away very much in this social force models or simplified to very basic rules. But in order to understand biological system, it might be that you might resort to this type of more elaborate models that actually take into account also the sensory and cognitive constraints of individuals. And this is also something I will allude to in the end of my talk. Okay, so far for collective motion. What about collective decision making as a second type of collective behavior? So what is it, first of all, how we define this? It's basically a process where a group of individuals decides between multiple options. And this is, again, a definition by ChatGPT. It's a bit more specific than what I wrote above here. It says, okay, collective decision-making explores the processes by which groups reach agreement or choices through methods like consensus building, democratic voting, or participative approaches. So it's already alludes a little bit to the mechanism. What are real-world scenarios for that? Well, you can think of experiments like this where we have groups of fish, and there's like this kind of Y-shaped maze. They can basically move in different directions. And in one direction, there's actually a cryptic predator hidden, which is difficult to see for the fish, but it's a kind of replica of a predator. The fish start here, and when they arrive here, they have to make a decision which arm they go. And then it's, of course, a right choice to go here, and a bad choice, which would be dangerous to go here. And in this nice paper of our collaborator, Jens Krause, and his co-workers, they showed that the fish groups, the larger they get, the better they get at the decision, and the faster they get. Okay. This is another example of collective decision-making now in an artificial system. So these are very simple robots, so-called kilobots, that we also have here in a lab. And they need to make a decision about the quality of two options, so they can move more or less randomly, like a swarm, forth and back. They can sample the environment here, sample the environment here, and then decide which side is better through some kind of a local decision-making algorithm where they kind of exchange opinions here in the middle. And in the end, you will see that the collective opinion converges to the red, which is the better option here. So this is another example of a kind of collective decision-making process, which is fully distributed. So there's no agent having the full information, but through interactions, the collective arrives at a very accurate decision about the state of the environment. But there are other models of collective decision-making, or they can be structured in different types. So what we saw are actually, the kilobot model actually falls in the realm of majority rules or quorums. So essentially the idea is that if you have a group, and this is a recent paper also of a collaborator of ours, when you have a group that basically an individual decides one way or the other based off what a certain fraction of its neighbors or group members makes. So that will be, for example, 50% do something, then I will do this as well. That's a majority rule. Or you can have any other quorum or any other threshold. So let's say I will go for this option if at least 30% of my neighbors already decided for this option, and I'm undecided. So that will be a kind of quorum rule. You can have Bayesian decision models where basically you try to combine or make individuals make decisions based on some sort of a version of a Bayesian decision process, which means that they have something like a prior about what the state of the environment is, and they want to make a decision for the better option. But they also take into account what others chosen before and modify the prior. If more agents decided before them for option A, they are more likely to pick option A, and then you can have a kind of well-defined Bayesian math for that. And it was shown by Arganda et al. That this type of Bayesian models actually map to many different decision processes that you actually see in natural collectives, in biological collectives. Another type of models for collective decision making, which actually we worked on explicitly, are so-called spin models, which are actually inspired by physics, by physical spin. So you can think of each agent to correspond to something like a physical spin. So it has a discrete state space. It can have just, if I have a binary decision process between option A and B, it can, for example, have only two states, for option A or for option B. So up or down in the spin. And then there's interaction between them, where agents watch what others are what the neighbors, what the opinion of the neighbors is, or decision of the neighbors is, and they can change their opinion based on what the neighbors are doing. You can have more than two states. Even for a binary decision task, you could have an undecided state in the middle, so you have three states, +1, 0, -1, for two options, +1, -1. And these models are also very popular and very useful. The nice thing is that there's nice correspondence to theories from statistical physics, so we understand actually a lot about the large-scale behavior of the systems just from previous research on physical systems. And the last type of models that I want to present here for modeling collective decision-making are social drift diffusion models, which actually try to capture the decision-making of individuals in a social context by some kind of integrator dynamics, which is coming actually from psychology. So it's actually a model for how individuals make decisions based on sensory inputs. So essentially, this is something like an internal decision state. So here in the middle, I would be undecided. And then I gather evidence for option A and B, so which would be the upper or lower threshold, which leads to a drift of my stochastic decision variable to either the upper bound or the lower bound. And once I hit the bound, I make a decision for option A. If I hit the lower bound, I make the decision for option B. And then I can see how the collective decides. So again, this is where, what others decided before actually can influence the drift of the later agents, the slower deciding agents. And the nice thing about this drift diffusion models is that actually there's a correspondence to Bayesian decision process. So they essentially can be shown to be on a higher level equivalent. The nice thing about these dynamical models is that we have actually evolution in time and continuous time. So we can look, for example, at how correlations in a state of the environment actually affect the decision making, like temporal correlations, something which is hard to do with other models, which are, for example, discrete in time. Here we have actually temporal dynamics of our environment, and individuals need to make a decision based on this. And this was also work from a former master student of mine, published 2 years ago. A very interesting special case is collective decision on the move. And this is insofar interesting because it actually combines flocking together with decision making. So here we have now a group, a swarm or a group of agents that are, some of them are informed, some of them are informed either for option A or option B. And here there's a slight majority, I think, for option B, for the red option, and that's the reason why the overall swarm goes to the red option. So there's no actual deliberation process or changing of opinions. Here the collective makes a collective decision based on the information already available in the group. And the interesting thing is that it's enough that one individual difference is in informed individuals already enough to make a very reliable collective decisions towards the majority option. And here is this the other way around now. Okay, so there is now a majority for white, and you can see that here it goes to white. Sometimes there's some kind of funny behavior. I'm not sure whether, no, we don't see it. Sometimes they can even oscillate between these two options. If they would be equal number of agents for white or red, you would see actually half of the times would the group go to white, half of the times would go to red. So there would be equal numbers. So there would be no, basically a random choice. And you can quantify this. So this is now from the same type of simulation, the kind of quantification showing this kind of nice splitting in decisions. So this is now when there's the equal number of informed agents for both options. And here this is the graph is not that easy to understand, but basically this is the preferred direction of the informed subset 2. And then what it shows is that initially the group goes into consensus direction. So if they have different angles they want to go to, they actually go, first they average and they go in a consensus direction, but at some point the two options become sufficiently separated. So the group has to decide, and this is where the kind of bifurcation of splitting up takes place, where some groups go up, some groups go down. If there's the equal number of informed agents for both agents, there's actually equal probability they go to one target or the other target. If there's already a difference of one more for one options, you see clearly that symmetry is being broken. So all go, for example, here to the option of the subset 2. Subset 1 and 2 would be the other direction. And this gets even more pronounced. So here you would see a little bit like a weak signal where some groups still go to the other option, but if there's a difference of 2 informed individuals, basically almost all the groups go to the option favored by the majority. So this is a very nice, it was a very nice study published in Nature in 2005. And since then, there have been some additional variants of this. And more recently, Ian Cousin and co-workers are actually connecting this type of group decision-making to actually how neurons make decisions in the brain of a single individual. And you can think of neurons in the brain in the same way as individuals in the collective trying to argue which direction to go. And you can actually find exactly the same type of bifurcations already for single animals going to multiple targets. So you see the same kind of bifurcation, and the predictions are actually almost identical in terms of the corresponding angles or positions where this decision takes place. So in a sense, whether you look at a collective of agents or a collective of neurons governing the dynamics of single agents, there seems to be some kind of universality in how this decision on the move takes place. Okay, let's come to opinion formation. I'm actually seeing that I'm very quickly running out of time, so I will try to speed up a little bit. So opinion formation is another form of collective behavior, and this is the process of evolution and competition of individual opinions or beliefs in a group. And again, ChatGPT is very close to that. It actually is a little bit more explicit what it all entails. And there's, again, a whole zoo of models of opinion formation. Here, I will just present, for example, one example of the de Groot model, a very influential one, where basically you can think now of opinion space. So this is not real space, but opinion space. And you have now a group of agents that all have, somewhere on this opinion space between 0 and 1, their opinion. It's a continuous variable. And then they try to align their opinion with the neighbors. So they get kind of attracted to the neighbors. And then you see that there, in this example, 2 stable clusters form of opinions. Or here you have other dynamics that there are first 3 clusters forming, which eventually merge, and then you have a consensus that all the system agrees on the same opinion. So this is, again, there's a whole zoo of potential models. This is just one example. You can have discrete opinion states, you can have continuous opinion states, you can have spin models, voter threshold models, and you can, so here this is kind of a all-to-all coupling, but you can have also, again, networks on which this opinion takes place, and you can have even adaptive networks. There's a whole literature on this. What is interesting is that opinion formation and decision-making, they are actually closely related. You can argue sometimes that's actually not clear is a decision-making or opinion formation model because they're almost equivalent in mathematical terms. In decision-making, the only difference is that usually there's a right answer, so that there is some set of environment where you want to make the right decision given the environmental state. For opinion formation models, you can argue that there is no right state. It's just really a belief or opinion. And they're all equivalent, and you just want to see how they actually segregate or form a consensus opinion. And if you put this on adaptive networks, then you can see this type of adaptive network model here. In addition to the opinion dynamics, we have also rewiring of the social interaction. And the idea is that if I don't like or I differ in opinion to my neighbor, I might prefer, instead of switching my opinion to that of neighbor, I might want to rewire to someone else, hoping that they are of my opinion. And this is a nice model which actually can be used to understand phenomena like echo chamber, like development of isolated communities, which basically share the same belief, the same opinions. So this will run for a while, but after a while, here I think we have, I don't know, many, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 opinions or so. In the end, it will just disintegrate into fragment into 6 isolated cluster, and then the dynamic will stop because every agent is happy with the local cluster with this kind of a homophilic distribution. So I'm just listening to others which are my opinion. So this is an example of an adaptive opinion network dynamics model, and here we see now the fragmentation. Maybe just a little bit advertisement. This is actually an online applet or an online website. You can play around with this model yourself. If you go to the website complexityexplorables.org, Dirk Brockmann, a former colleague of mine who recently moved to Dresden, actually has a collection of many models of complex systems, including many models of collective behavior, like flocking, like this opinion formation. And you can actually change parameters using sliders and play around with these models yourself, explore how they behave. Okay, and the last one, which is a little bit different, but still something we work on, and therefore I will mention it here, is spreading processes as a form of collective behavior. And behavioral or emotional contagion basically means spreads of behaviors or emotional states through groups. And again, ChatGPT is very similar to that, and mentioned explicitly social networks, but again, this is very closely aligned. And one real-world example of this is actually fun to watch. This is the U-Bahn in Berlin. Make it a bit louder. So this is contagion of laughing in the U-Bahn. So there are actually few people who on purpose start laughing. So they're kind of trying to make the whole U-Bahn laugh. And they actually succeed quite well. So there are some random people joining in because laughing is contagious. And you should watch this lady back there. She doesn't join before. And then she joins in. So she can hold it, becomes infected by the laughing of herself. So you see the spreading process. And actually watching this, it's hard not to smile yourself. It's a kind of, really, we are social animals and laughter is very contagious. But there might be other behaviors spreading, and this is another form of behavior spreading, which is actually not fun. It's actually an escape behavior or scared behavior. So this is a so-called startle behavior or escape, or fast escape behavior that spreads through a group of fish. And it has been actually intensively studied by neuroscientists on an individual level, because this is a reflex-like response of fish to visual or auditory stimuli which signal threat. And if a fish perceives that, it kind of jumps away from the perceived threat. It's a very quick acceleration. And what is known is that actually, just a single neural structure is responsible for that. So it's really like a neuron that integrates input and suddenly it fires. But what colleagues of ours actually did, they actually studied how this behavior can also spread through the group and then quantified that. And it's really nice because it allows us to really quantify also what the interaction network is. So we can, from this type of data, we can estimate who responds to whom, which is really hard in general in collective behavior. And what we can do is we can now take these networks and run this kind of, so this is actually a real fish network, and we can run this contagion models, or our contagion models on that to understand, what are the properties, under which condition does this behavior spread through the whole group, and what is the actual kind of parameters that the real fish schools operate at. And so this is just one example where like a single spontaneously startled or activated individual where this behavior spreads very quickly. Oops. That shouldn't have happened. I apologize, I will restart it again. So, and how this behavior, in this example for this parameter, spreads across the whole group. How do you model this? Well, the idea is again that we have a network. And in this network, we have susceptible individuals that are not activated yet. They don't show this escape response, this scared response. But there are some that actually do that. And they are sending activation signals through the social interactions to others that are perceived by others. And the focal individual here integrates this activation signal from neighbors. And once it hits a threshold, it becomes scared itself, it performs the behavior itself. So in a sense, again, it's kind of integrated dynamics, but now it's not a decision between two options, the decision of doing something or not doing something. So staying or escaping. And then we have this transition then from a non-active or susceptible state to a kind of active or infected state, and then there can be a recovered state when they stay for some time. So this is how would you model this. So it's actually very, very much resembles epidemic spreading. And this is known that a lot of contagion phenomena can be modeled in the same way as epidemic spreading, as spreading of pathogens. However, what is also known that behavioral contagion is actually fundamentally different also from the epidemic spreading because it's a form of so-called complex contagion. For epidemic spreading, only a single contact is enough of an infected person for me to getting infected with some probability. And my overall infection probability is actually a superposition of many pairwise contacts. For behavioral contagion, for social contagion, so-called complex contagion, it's actually not necessarily enough to have one contact, but there's actually a strong dependency on how many reinforcing contacts I have with multiple people being activated at the same time. So in a sense, I could have a kind of nonlinear threshold-like response that if 1, 2, 3 of my neighbors do something, I don't join. But once 5, 6, 7 or more than half of my neighbors do something, then I definitely do that. And this is very different from epidemic spreading. Okay. I will skip the synchronization. If anyone is interested, I can talk about this in the end. And I will also, and I will now very briefly discuss these different behaviors, how you can classify them. Actually, from a statistical physics point of view, this is where I come from, you can understand this different phenomena in a kind of combined fashion or a kind of zoomed out fashion. And what one can show is that they are actually very similar to each other. So despite being very different collective behaviors in terms of biology, like collective movement or collective decision making, they actually, from kind of physics, fundamental physics point of view, they're very similar because there we have something like a transition from a disordered state. You can think of all agents moving in different directions. So there's, on average, they don't move anything, or all agents have different opinions or different decision states, so that they average out to 0. So that would be the disordered state. Or they all align and start to move either in the same direction or they have all the same decision. So then suddenly there is actually one decision state or one direction which is picked by the system spontaneously through social interactions. And this is an example of what is called spontaneous symmetry breaking in physics. And this is, all these forms of very different collective behaviors can be actually mapped to this kind of emergent of order from disorder. And order means that, all agents somehow point, for example, in the same direction through so-called spontaneous symmetry breaking. Behavioral contagion, the last example that I discussed, is kind of different to that because it's actually a different type of process in physics that would map to that, which is called percolation transition. Because it's not about breaking the symmetry between multiple options, it's about something actually going through the whole system, like the activation wave going through or not, in the same way as in percolation for those who are familiar with this concept. Okay, because I'm running out of time, I will skip all, very briefly talk only about the composite behaviors. So here you can now actually look at processes where you combine two of these things. For example, collective movement and contagion spreading. So here we have a self-organized groups forming, but then we have also this color encodes like an information spreading through the group through a contagion process. So there's a combination of both processes. Or you can have oscillators that try to synchronize and they also interact, and based on how well they're synchronized, they either attract or repel each other, and you see this nice, beautiful patterns emerging, complex dynamics. This is a paper by O'Keefe and Strogatz, and you can also find it on a Complexity Explorable website if you're interested to learn more about this. You can think about collective foraging, and this is actually a project where David is also working on. So this is how multiple agents actually explore like a resource environment. And again, you can have aspects of swarming here, but also of individual exploration, individual search for resources, which is combined then into this collective foraging process. Okay, but I would like to use the last remaining 5 to 10 minutes to actually dive deeper a little bit in a topic which is very dear to my heart, going back to collective movement, to flocking behavior, and the idea of changing really the paradigm, how we model the system, changing a little bit the perspective, how we think about the system, and moving beyond the social force models that I introduced in the beginning, and that actually, I would say 90% of models in the literature rely on this type of social force concept. And in particular, I'm interested in vision-based flocking based purely on visual interactions. So again, let's rephrase the classical flocking models as I introduced them before. So there are these phenomenological social forces between individuals. There's a repulsion at short ranges, there's an alignment at intermediate ranges, and attraction at long range. As I said, these models have been around for more than 50 years, and they are a great tool to study self-organization. And we use these models as well, but they have also some very important shortcomings. So, whereas they are very good at studying self-organization, they seem to have a very limited predictive power. And what I mean by that is when you work with these models and you try to match them to experimental data, it often feels more like fitting and almost never like predicting. And what I mean by that is that you can actually choose your parameters, and you have many parameters in these models, but you could choose them that you can reproduce existing data. So you have the same patterns and the same maybe group structure. But once something about the experimental conditions change, which leads to a change in the group pattern, you might think, for example, for fish, turbidity of the water. You might think, oh, okay, I have an idea what turbidity makes. It limits my visual range. Therefore, if I reduce the interaction range in the model, that should qualitatively reproduce what happens in experiment. But a friend of ours did that actually, and this is not what happens. Suddenly, the dynamics of the biological system change in a way that does not match at all what you would predict from just reducing the interaction range because of increased turbidity of water. And you have basically to fit your parameters from scratch again for the new scenario. And you can make this work again and you get some reasonable agreement, but you don't know why you had to change the parameters the way you had to change. And the second thing is that they typically assume, or most models of collective movement actually assume idealized empty environments. This is something I don't have time to talk about, but this is an important feature as well, that real world behavior doesn't really happen in an empty fish tank most of the time. But most importantly, and this is what I want to focus today, is that these type of models don't actually account for the sensory and cognitive constraints of what the agents are capable to do or what kind of sensory information they receive. Because they have these phenomenological social forces, it's kind of a bird-eye perspective. You just assume that there's some kind of attraction, repulsion, alignment, a little bit like forces between physical particles. But that's not what an individual does. It doesn't feel forces. It actually receives sensory inputs. It processes sensory inputs and makes movement decision based on the sensory input, which may look like attraction, like an attractive force, but they are not a force in a physical sense. And this is why, at some points, this, great models for studying self-organization might fail to actually explain real-world flocking or schooling phenomena. There's another issue with this kind of social force models is that they actually usually have very simplistic way of choosing what are the neighbors. And in the classical sense, it's usually only based on distance. So there was like close by, intermediate ranges, long ranges. Based on this, I had different interactions. And then there was a cutoff range. Beyond this range, there was no social interaction classically. This type of models are typically referred to as metric models because the interaction depends on the distance explicitly. And it can, beyond a certain distance, there's no interaction. And most of the models, again, I would say 80% maybe, rely on historically on this kind of a metric interaction model. But based on some experimental data, actually people suggested, well, the social forces might not be dependent on distance. They actually might act in the same way, irrespective whether, for birds, whether one bird is 1 meter away or 5 meters away. It doesn't really play that much of a role within the kind of reasonable biological ranges. And they actually came up with the idea based on studying collective bird flying dynamics, is that actually a focal bird or a focal individual pays attention to a certain set of nearest neighbors independent of their actual distance. So whether they're 1 meter or 2 meters away, doesn't really matter, but it matters whether it's the nearest neighbor, the second nearest neighbor, or the fifth nearest neighbor. So for example, the focal individual only interacts with the 6 nearest neighbors and ignores everyone else. So this is what is referred to as topological models in this kind of flocking or modeling collective motion literature. Another version of topological models can be, instead of having like a fixed set of n nearest neighbors, is that you interact with the first shell of your neighbors. That could be realized, for example, through a Voronoi tessellation, where you in 2D subdivide the space, and then you can define for each point through this Voronoi tessellation the first shell of nearest neighbors, and you have only interaction with those nearest neighbors. That would be another assumption for a topological interaction, which does not depend on distance, but only on where relative to others am I. And more recently, it was suggested that maybe instead of these different networks, actually, if we have visual interaction, we should look at visual interaction networks. So who sees whom potentially? And in this paper by Ari Steinberg-Peshkin, it was actually shown that this networks describe best the collective behavior of fish in certain experiments, with the metric being the worst, the topological being the KNN being the second worst, and the Voronoi being the second best, closely resembling the visual results, only trailing slightly behind. Which can be understood in a sense, because if you think of a visual network, what it takes into account are possible occlusions because of extended body of agents in this quasi-2D environment. So this fish cannot be seen because it's behind this one, just the visual path is blocked. But if you think of this Voronoi, the first shell of neighbors, these are definitely the visual neighbors, always. And potentially those that are farther behind have a slower influence, therefore the kind of Voronoi neighborhood might be a good approximation of visual networks. And that's the reason why it kind of matches almost as good as the visual networks to the real data. But it actually shows that taking into account the sensory constraints might be important for collective behavior. But what is also a consequence of these different networks, depending what you prefer to choose, you will realize that the large-scale behavior, the collective behavior, depends very much on the choice of your network. So even if you have the same social forces, if you just change the network from metric to Voronoi or metric to topological, you might get very different collective behaviors. And again, which network do you choose? And there are maybe some suggestions that based on vision you choose one of those. But in principle, again, by ignoring the actual process of sensing and processing the sensory information, we actually don't know which network is the right one. So what I suggested a while back when I applied for my independent research group was to have a change in perspective. So typical flocking models usually assume this type of a bird-eye perspective. So I have here an agent, let's say, and it moves in a 2D environment. And typically, what I mean by bird-eye perspective, that we would assume that there are some kind of forces acting between the agents and some objects in the environment. Here it could be static obstacles, it could be other agents. So just like as vectors, as particle interactions. However, when we think of an agent that actually perceives this could be more of a picture that we see here. So this is a single agent moving in a field of static obstacles. And what we see on a right-hand side is actually the visual input it has on its one-dimensional visual retina. So this is the left eye, it's 360-degree vision from the front to the back, right eye from the front to the back. And the different black patches are just a different obstacle, what it sees as a projection of the different patches. So if I go back, it was quick. If I go back, so here now we will see this agent will arrive here, and then I will highlight the different obstacles. And these are actually these blobs here in the visual field that we see. So this greenish one is actually behind the focal agent, somewhere to the back. This one is almost up to the front, a little bit to the right. So this is what shows up here. So this is actually the spatiotemporal visual input that the agent receives on its kind of effectively one-dimensional retina. And now imagine you have a whole swarm of such agents. Everyone moves around, and everyone perceives just a visual projection of others. So you'll get a very complicated spatiotemporal visual field which others need to act on. And that was the motivation for us to see, can we actually take this as a starting point? The great thing about this for this visual fields is that in principle we can already, using the computer vision, we can recover them in experimental data. So this is an example again from collaborators of ours where they take a single fish and they track the visual field, what they potentially can see in one eye and the other eye, just from the position of the fish and the position of the other fish. And what you can see is that it varies very much where in the school the fish is, whether it's a high density environment or low density environment. So what we suggest, or what we are interested in, is this new class of flocking models, where the social interaction force is now not based on some kind of phenomenological social forces, but where we want to put eyes on the agent and have the social force as a function of this spatiotemporal visual field. And the great thing is that it actually can allow us potentially to link this type of models also to something like a sensory physiology. What can the eye resolve? What is the reaction time? What is the even like the neural processing eventually? So there's a lot of research going on sensory neuroscience here. And in the long term, in 10, 20 years, we are maybe able even to integrate collective behavior with this type of neuroscience. I very quickly go through the type of model that we developed for this. It's kind of a minimal vision-based model. Again, we have agents in 2D. And the idea is that each agent sends something like rays, cast. So this generates the visual field. And here we now assume that we have these different agents have different colors. So that could be, if we have individual recognition, that would be the visual field that this focal agent sees here. All right? So this is like the yellow is here. It kind of overlaps with the green one because they're so close by. And then we said, okay, let's make the simplest assumption possible that they don't have even individual recognition, so we just see black and white. It's the simple version of the visual field that you can receive. There's something, there's nothing. And that means even that if two agents are close by, you don't see them as two different blobs, it's just a single blob because they overlap. So there's no individual recognition, there's no concept of others around, there's no concept of distance, right? The only thing I see is just this black-white pattern. So I don't know that there are other agents around, I don't know what the distance is, I don't know what their speed is. But this is the only information we wanted to use. And the idea is, and I will go rather quickly through this, that you can actually write down your effective movement response, like an effective force due to vision, as integration over your visual field with two parts, two components. One is this actually functional that describes what is the visual input at a given time and how does this visual input influence my movement response? Turning left, turning right, speeding up, slowing down. And the second part here is a kind of a vector that just encodes the input-independent properties of the visual motor system. So like the symmetries and the blind angles potentially and so on. And then, this functional, this is a general object, mathematical object, but we can write something like a Taylor thesis for Taylor expansion thesis for this functional in the same way you would expand a function or approximate a function. And here we write this kind of series of lowest orders of derivatives of this visual field. And we just keep the two lowest orders to describe it. So this is basically the response to the mass of the visual field. And here we have a derivative in a retinal space. So this would be the edges in the visual space. So is there something, there's nothing that creates an edge. And that's the only two things that we pay attention to, blobs and edges. And in particular, we also don't have any time derivative, so there's really no motion of optical flow or anything. And the cool thing is that already with these two interactions, we can actually create a short-range repulsion and a long-range attraction. We can reproduce the movement response of a single fish to its neighbor. And most importantly, we can reproduce, when we vary two core parameters, we can reproduce all the different patterns of collective movement that people also observed with classical social force models. And here just give you a very quick visual kind of impression of these. So this is now a swarming state where the agents come together, so they are cohesive, but they don't coordinate the movement. So they basically disorder inside, a little bit like a mosquito swarm. But they're very good at avoiding collision, so there's no collision in there, although every agent only perceives the black-white pattern and reacts to that. So they have no concept of distance explicitly in the model. Another one is where we actually start from random initial conditions, and again, they initially are disordered, but here in this particular parameters, we will see actually a highly ordered collective movement. All the agents will start to move in the same direction, a kind of very organized linear flocking movement. And you can already see emerging this, they will start to move to this direction. And again, they are able to coordinate a movement not because they know what the movement direction of others is. They have no idea about this. They don't even know that they are others because they don't even have an individual recognition. They just see these black-white patterns. But everyone responds with similar set of rules to these black-white patterns, and through self-organization, eventually this highly synchronized correlated state emerges. And I will skip the last one. You can extend it to 3D, but something which I'm very excited about, a paper that just got accepted with David as first author, we were able to implement the same algorithm in actual mobile robots. So that is purely vision-based movement of robots. So they only use the kind of input stream for the camera, and they just use, they detect the individuals, but they just use basically whether it's a blob or not, whether it overlaps or not, in the same way we had in the original model. And the cool thing about this, first of all, it looks very naturalistic compared to other control algorithms for swarm robotics, which I like very much. So when you would look at the tracking, you cannot really say whether it's a group of fish or a group of robots. So it's a very natural movement. But second of all is it does not even rely on the same communication protocol between them. They just use vision, and it could be even very different robots that move together, and they don't need to exchange any information apart from the vision scene that they create anyway when moving together. And with this, I'm at the end. I am unfortunately a bit over time, so sorry for that, but I hope you bear with me. I will skip the take-home message. I think it was a lot of information already, but I'm happy to take questions and open for discussion.